Today you're going to hear my second lecture on costs. This one's important. If you get lost here, you may stay lost, so re-listen on Moodle if you need to. But before I get into the main topic for today, average total cost and marginal cost, I want to address another element of cost. I showed my husband the lecture I'd recorded on elasticity. I thought he'd enjoy my comment that my demand for replacement husbands was pretty inelastic. Unfortunately for me, he took even more economics courses in college than I did, and he fired right back with this question. So, when are you going to teach them about sunk costs? It's a very good question for reasons I hope will become apparent. The textbook I use does not mention sunk costs, and neither does your textbook. But I agree with my husband. It's an important concept, and I don't know why it was left out of the course. I'm going to stick it back in. So let's watch a short video clip. It's from a TV show called The King of Queens, which I confess I'd never heard of, but it is a great illustration of sunk costs. Okay, you've seen the clip. What do you think the term sunk costs means? And why might my husband have used it to describe our 35-year marriage? In economics, a sunk cost is any past cost that has already been paid and cannot be recovered. For example, a business may have invested $1 million in new hardware. This money's gone. It can't be recovered. So it should not figure into the business's decision-making process going forward. Or say you buy tickets to a concert on the day of the event. You get the flu, even though you're throwing up, you feel terrible, you decide to go to the concert anyway, otherwise you would have, quote, wasted your money. Which that really means is you just fell for the sunk cost fallacy. So, was my husband assuming that our 35 years of marriage represented a sunk cost? I don't think I'm going to go there. But I would note that when I Googled for images of sunk cost, one of the very first to show up was this poster. The source is www.infidelityhelpgroup.com. Well. We actually encounter the sunk cost fallacy quite often in our daily lives. Say you purchased a non-returnable shirt on sale. You wear it a couple of times, realize it's not flattering. Do you keep on wearing it even if you have enough other shirts to wear just because you already paid for it? Nope. Again, I realize I'm repeating myself somewhat, but I want this idea to sink in. That money is gone. You need to move on. And it's an important concept for business firms, and they often make a mistake about it. In fact, failing to let sunk costs go is a very common reason for firms to enter bankruptcy. So let's assume a company has spent $5 million building a factory that's not yet complete when technology basically renders it obsolete. The company has to consider the $5 million as sunk since it cannot get that money back. The firm must decide at this point whether continuing construction to complete the project will help the company regain the sunk cost. If it won't, they should walk away, swallow those missing $5 million, painful though it will be. Often, however, businesses make the mistake of continuing to sink more money into investments that will actually reduce their profits. It's hard to walk away from big investments, and it's hard for individuals as well as firms. So, which is what I'm going to do just now. Walk away from sunk costs and do a quick review. Remember the production function from way back before the long weekend? And I remember that this is one of these graphs that builds very slowly. There we see it. And marginal physical product, you need to know that term, is again the amount of output that one additional unit of input, say an additional worker, adds to output. The law of diminishing returns, also something you need to know, says that if other inputs are held constant, eventually additional inputs will produce lower and lower marginal physical product. You remember total and fixed cost, right? I found this chart on the internet, and I like that it gives a longer list of costs that would fit into both categories. So why, for example, might taxes for this firm be considered a variable cost? Well, I'm guessing that it refers to payroll taxes or even sales tax on raw materials. In fact, taxes tend to fall into both categories. Property taxes are usually a fixed cost. Taxes that vary with the amount of production, like payroll taxes or sales taxes on material, will be variable costs. Notice, too, that in the short term, this firm considers part-time employees paid on an hourly basis as a variable cost and full-time salaried employees as a fixed cost. Why would that be? Well, it really makes sense. Salaried employees are not paid by the hour, and presumably in the short run, they are paid even if the firm isn't producing anything. Remember, there are no fixed costs in the long run. I won't give you any variable or fixed cost questions that are this hard to interpret, but I thought this list was actually more realistic than the one I used. And now we do enter new territory. Average total cost is just what it sounds like. It is total cost divided by quantity. So why would it be important for a business to know its average total cost? Well, think of it this way. What is another name for average total revenue? Again, in the short run. It's really price, right? If I sell 100 cookies for $1 a piece, my average total revenue is $1. How much money will I make on each cookie? I will make my average total revenue, that is the price, minus my average total cost per cookie. Gets a little more complicated than that. We'll return to that next unit. So here's a cost table. Note that the fixed costs are the same. It's the cost of operating my business even when I'm not producing anything, or the costs I incur at zero rate of output. Very easy to find fixed cost. Total cost is, and we've done this before, fixed cost plus variable cost. Average total cost, I just talked about, is fixed cost divided by output. I warned you there were going to be a lot of cost terms. So what do you observe looking in this chart about the movement of average total costs? Look at that right-hand column. Well, they go down at first and then they go up again. And this is typical of average total cost. So why would that be? Well, the answer is that at first, as your production increases, as the output increases, fixed costs are being spread over more and more units, what we call economies of scale. Eventually, however, the law of diminishing returns kicks in. New inputs produce less and less marginal product. That is, with everything else held constant, without building a bigger factory, getting a lot of new machinery or whatever. So at this point, average total costs begin to increase. As usual, believe it or not, this is actually easier to see on a graph, even one of these slowly building graphs. So this is a clearer graph, I thought, and more like the ones I'll use in your quiz. But again, you see that typical U-shaped curve, average total cost decline, and then they go up. And in a minute, we'll get to the point at which they go up. So this is just says in words what we just saw in pictures. They start high, fall, then rise again, have a distinctive U-shaped curve. And now we get to by far the most important of your cost. The word marginal is always the most important word. You'll have a better understanding of why marginal cost is so important when we get to our next unit. But I'm going to spoil the surprise and say that it turns out that the marginal cost curve is the same as the supply curve for a firm, and the cumulative or additive marginal cost curves are market supply. So up until now, supply curve has been going, the marginal cost curve has been going under an assumed name. We will unveil it more thoroughly in our next unit. But for now, you need to know that marginal cost is the amount that total cost increases with the addition of one more unit of output. So here's a marginal cost table. I'm not going to give you anything quite this complicated. In my cost tables, the rate of output always goes up by 1, saving you a division step. See, I am not always a wicked witch. Notice that marginal cost, too, tends to go down at first, thanks to economies of scale. It is usually cheaper and more efficient to produce several dozen cookies than a single dozen cookies. While one batch is baking, my pastry chef can be whipping up the next batch or taking the cooled cookies off the rack, whatever. At some point, however, I reach a point of diseconomies of scale. The output simply overwhelms the baker in the short run. In the long run, of course, we can get a bigger building, more bakers, etc. So here is the same information presented graphically. I think this is actually not as clear a marginal cost curve as some with its sudden jump up at the end there. And therefore, I'm going to show you this one, which I think shows the usual shape of both curves a little more clearly. So what do you notice about the relationship between average total cost and marginal cost? When average total cost is declining, the average total cost curve is negatively sloped. Marginal cost is less than average total cost. When the average total cost curve begins to rise, the average total cost curve is positively sloped, marginal cost is greater than average total cost. And average total cost is at its very lowest point where it intersects marginal cost. All of this is very easy to see graphically, and it also makes perfect sense. So that's a lot of complicated words that you shouldn't have to memorize if you can figure out the logic. So once marginal cost is greater than average total cost has to rise with additional production. That's simply what averages mean. And here's a slightly trickier question. How could we use this graph to calculate total cost? Well, consider an output of 15. At that, we see that the average total cost is 60. So if we're producing 60 units, each with an average total cost, 15 units, each with an average total cost of 60, then total cost is just 60 times 15, or 900. Your practice quiz will give you an opportunity to look at these graphs and figure out whether you really do understand them. You're also, on your practice quiz and your real quiz and your unit test, going to be deriving costs from a cost table similar to the one you see here with a lot of blanks. Actually, you can fill in all of these blanks quite easily with the information you have. Trust me and follow along as we fill this in. You're going to get a similar chart for your practice quiz and a similar, different numbers, chart for the quiz that counts. So let's start with the easiest one. What is the firm's fixed cost? Well, it's $100, right? Total cost at a zero rate of production. So we've got that filled in. What are variable costs at a production rate of 0? There aren't any. There aren't any marginal costs either. So let's move on, and you can't divide by 0, right? So average total cost is the null set. So let's move on to a production quantity of 1 when we're actually accomplishing something. If fixed costs are $100 and variable costs are $120, what are total costs? This one you should not need your calculators for. 120 plus 100 is 220, right? Average total cost is 220 divided by 1. Again, it will be 220. And marginal cost, the amount costs go up, is going to be the same as the variable cost for this first unit, or 120. So let's move on to production at a quantity of 2. If marginal costs are $10 for this next unit, what will be the total variable cost? 120, the variable cost at a production quantity of 1, plus 10, or 130 for a total variable cost. That's a cumulative number, note. The marginal cost is the measurement of the next unit. So what are average total costs? You just divide 230 by the quantity, which is 2, and you get 115. Told you I would keep these numbers simple. But do pay careful attention to instructions about how you enter your answers in Moodle. I will almost always ask you when the answer is monetary to give numbers to the nearest hundredths, in other words, including the cents place, but not using a dollar sign. So $120 is put in 120.00, no dollar sign. So on to the next line, a quantity of 3. We get a variable cost of 150 up from a variable cost of 130 at a quantity of 2. So total cost is 250. That's just fixed cost plus variable cost. Average total cost, divide 250 by 3. That's 83.33. That's one where you need to round to the nearest hundredth. What is marginal cost? Well, variable cost goes from 130 at a production of 2 to 150 at a production of 3. So marginal cost must be 20. Now, what about quantity number 4? Well, again, if marginal cost is 30, then the new variable cost must be 180 or 150 plus 30. And that makes total cost 280 and an average total cost 280 divided by 4, or 70. And we're done. That goes by pretty quickly, I realize, but actually this is not very difficult, and I have found it to be a good way to get your mind wrapped around the differences between these different kinds of costs, which you're really going to need to understand for the next unit. You're going to get a chance to practice this. You have a chart like this for your practice quiz. I'm hoping your teacher's been able to hand it out. If not, it's on Moodle and you can reproduce it. Notice too that I have now set the practice quizzes so that you can check your answer immediately. I have not really done practice quizzes like this before, and when I was looking at Moodle, I thought, that would be a useful feature, so now I'm using it. Remember, you can also take these practice quizzes as often as you need, and they will stay open until the end of the semester. There's a threat. Okay, we're going to return to average total cost and marginal cost in the next unit, where we will see how they determine the firm's optimal level of output. But there's another determinant there. We have to bring back price, and therefore we have to bring back demand and the equilibrium price where supply equals demand. Before we do that, I want to go back and review supply and demand, and especially shifts in supply and demand. In my years teaching this course, I learned that this is a difficult concept for many students, but it's one I really want you to wrap your head around because it explains so many developments in the economy. Now, I'd note that one change that Mr. Johnson made in my Unit 1 test was to cut back on problems asking you to identify how some particular event shifted either supply or demand. This is evidence he's nicer than I am. You should sing whistle that Wicked Witch theme song again. But as I've just explained, I think understanding these shifts and how they affect price and quantity is very important. I always include lots of these problems in both my Unit 1 and my Unit 2 test. And I'm not going to change my ways. But next class, I am going to give you a review of this material and a practice quiz that will give you a lot of opportunity to get better at identifying these shifts and their consequences, where you'll be able to check whether you're thinking about the right way immediately. And by the way, I will not be delivering the lecture. You're going to get to hear from Indiana Jones instead. So let me close with just one last topic before I finish out cost and the lecture portion of Unit 2. Accounting costs are just what they sound like. They're the costs you need to talk over with your accountant. They're the ones that you write checks to pay. Economic costs returns us to the concept of opportunity cost. I think the easiest way to think about it is, suppose I inherited a house from my grandmother with no mortgage. Oops, sorry, I did not mean to go forward just yet. And I decided to run my chocolate chip cookie business out of my grandmother's house, which I now own free and clear. I don't have to write a check to anyone. I don't have an accounting cost, but I do have an opportunity cost. What is it? Well, if I weren't using the house for my business, I could rent it out. So by using the house for my business, I am incurring an opportunity cost of foregone rent. Similarly, suppose I don't pay myself a salary. What opportunity cost am I incurring? And the answer is the wages I could earn at some alternative job. So economic costs are accounting costs plus any implicit opportunity cost. This actually has some very important implications for small businesses with a single proprietor and for businesses such as family farms. And we're going to look at that in the next unit as well. I'll close with one more scary graph, which is basically a review, but also brings together the first and second cost lectures. What does it mean when I say that a production function shifts up? Remember the production possibilities curve? It means I'm getting more production from the same amount of a fixed output. How could this happen? We'll watch this happening right in front of you. Well, I could buy a new and more efficient oven or industrial mixer, for example, for my chocolate chip cookie business, and it would produce more cookies with the same single baker. I could send my baker to cooking school to learn more efficient techniques and improve her productivity. Note that once I'm producing more with the same input, the same variable cost, my average total cost goes down. That's very good news. Why? We'll look at that the next unit. Okay. Oops, I didn't finish building that. Sorry about that. The cost quiz you will take next class includes multiple choice as well as problem questions. You may use your notes and you may also use your textbook. I've noted the pages here. But the quiz will be timed, and so I think it would be a mistake to try to count on getting all the answers from the textbook. By the way, as I changed the announcements to say this, I've now already written a makeup quiz. This is easy because what I did, Moodle lets me duplicate quizzes, is I wrote the cost quizzes. They come in 2 parts. And then I looked them over and I deleted what I thought were tough questions, except on the makeup quiz where I didn't delete them. There, instead, I added a few problems to that, some percent change, some elasticity, lots of fun stuff. Why am I doing that? It's really not to be mean. I do not want to chase after students for makeups this quarter. And I want you to stay on top of this material because this course builds and you need to understand cost to do well in the next unit. I'm going to put more extra credit reading quizzes up on Moodle when I return from vacation and am otherwise caught up with life. Until then, look forward to seeing you in a week and a half. 2 weeks.